I think to start with, it's okay just to recognize that difference, just to recognize the neurodiversity of a team being a fact.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. It's time for another episode of the Ramos Law Difference Makers podcast, where I, as your host, Dr. Jim Hoven, get a chance to meet with cool people doing cool things, making a difference, and hopefully inspire you to make a difference in some small way in your world today. I'm super excited for this guest because this is a topic that I know nothing about. Of course, many of the topics we talk about, I don't know much about because we bring in people that are making a difference in all sorts of areas of life. But this one was really kind of fundamentally changing for me because my mind had never even crossed or passed the intersection of something known as neurodiversity. And we're going to talk about that today with kind of the leading edge expert in neurodiversity. His name is Ed Thompson, and Ed's the CEO of a company called Uptimize. And has he done this before? Let me tell you something. Here's where I can't even give you all of the places Ed's been because there's too many, but he's been featured on LinkedIn, the BBC, People Management Magazine, HR.com, Financial Times, and more and more and more. So instead of taking all the time of the cool places that he's been, I wanted him to share his story with you. Also, just to throw this out there, Ed has written a book and it's called Unlocking the Potential of Neurodiversity at Work. So if this sounds like something that could be above your head, no, it is absolutely not. This is going to show you how the brain differs, how we think differently, and how that applies in any situation, even though we'll predominantly be talking about it in the workplace today. So without further ado, I want to introduce and welcome Mr. Ed Thompson. Ed, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
So we talked a little bit before we started airing, and I'm so fascinated by this topic because, I got into chiropractic practice in 1991, so a long time ago. And we as professionals in the healthcare industry are always talking about the nervous system, right? As chiropractors, we want to work with the musculoskeletal system and the nervous system to bring back what we call homeostasis. So when I saw this term, neuroinclusion, neurodiversity, I'm like, wait, what is this? So I had to dig in a little bit more, but I want you to tell it as the guy who's kind of that person who's leading this edge, this forefront of change in how we work together, and define that for us.
Absolutely. Neurodiversity is a fundamental human fact of our species. And what it means is, in a sense, what it sounds like. It means that human brains and minds are different. There's no one normal brain. There's a great quote from a neurodiversity expert that says you can't go to a museum and see the normal brain in a jar. It doesn't exist. So what that means is we all process information differently because our brains are wired differently. We all experience the world differently as a result.
Yeah.
And when it comes to how we work, how we collaborate, and so on, we all have different preferences, different strengths and challenges. We know this at work, but different preferences too in terms of things like how we communicate, how we problem solve, and so on. And sometimes we say this to a manager and they're a little bit cynical. Now, you get that manager to do a show of hands in their team who prefers my instructions by email or verbally and so on, and they're going to get different answers. And in a sense, that's neurodiversity in action.
Okay. So let me ask you this. I don't know how incredibly popular it is these days, but I know there's been a time where personality tests were really big in the workplace and in organizations because and there was a bunch of different tests. I really loved the DISC, the DISC test, and we would, get all our team members measured up to see how they were and how they responded to stress, and then we could work together with them through me communicating in a little bit of their style and them communicating with a little bit of my style. How does neurodiversity interplay or differ from personality differences?
I think it's a little bit deeper. So just how our brains actually work in terms of, again, some of these preferences around how we communicate, problem solve, work, and so on. So I think I need to give a bit of background here. So
please.
One of the favorite questions I think about this and I find fascinating, was one of the reasons I wrote my book, was why are we talking about this now if this is just this fundamental reality of humans? Why are we talking about it today? Why haven't we engaged with that beforehand? And I think, and I'm going to focus on business a little bit, but kind of bring in the societal piece as well. You've had these kind of two strands that are only now just meeting. So humans have always been neurodiverse. This realization, I think, began through the medical labeling of some what they call conditions, now known as neurotypes or different neuroidentities, over only the last 100 or so years.
Can you give us some examples?
The discovery of, if you like, autism in the 1940s. The naming of dyslexia as a learning difference or learning disability, ADHD and so on. These are all very new terms that have said, these particular people who meet these diagnostic criteria. And generally that's diagnostic criteria on deficiencies or challenges. It's what, a kid can't do as well as their peers. It puts them in a box and says, they have a different brain, if you like. And it wasn't till the 1990s, you had the nascent internet, and you had neurodivergent people, i.e. people with that sort of identity, online saying, hey, coming together and saying, hey, the world doesn't understand us, right? They put us in a box, everything's negative about us because of those medical labels. And actually, we want to build a world where people just recognize we just have a slightly different brain wiring. Mm-hmm. And it was in the 1990s that the term neurodiversity was first used. And we have something called a neurodiversity movement, which is to change society, to say, look, let's not just see people who are autistic as kind of fringe disabled people who have all these challenges. Let's see them as humans like everybody else with their own strengths, just a different brain wiring within this kind of human neurodiverse landscape. Now, to take the other strand, that's the sort of business consciousness that I think there's been for the last 30 or 40 years, where people do think differently. I think people realize that. I mean, any manager sees their team and realizes their team isn't the same. So you have these, personality tests that will reveal somebody to be, a creator or an innovator or an introvert or whatever it is. And I think they're good. I mean, I think that's going down the right path, but I don't think it necessarily goes far enough. So if I'm your manager, is it helpful for me to know you're more of a creator than a systemizer? Maybe, but it's more helpful to know from you, how does your brain work? How do you really think? Again, how do you want to receive my instructions? If we're strategizing as a team, how do you want to contribute? That's the sort of practical reality. Or what sort of environment do you work in? Do you have a particular sensitivity to certain sensory inputs that means actually right now you're very uncomfortable and can't concentrate? Mm-hmm. So there's a depth to what we call neuroinclusion that sort of forges those two things. This idea of a neurodiversity movement, look, we all think differently. And then that kind of growing business consciousness that people are actually different and we need to embrace that to be successful.
So just for clarity's sake, when you were kind of defining neurodiversity from the 90s, they were taking these folks that were put in, as you call them, almost boxes where you're different and you're disabled, you're not fully able. Does neurodiversity extend beyond that to someone who doesn't have any label on them, but rather they just think differently, like the right brain, left brain, labeling of one person's more into artistic and music and this kind of thing. The other's more logic. You got Mr. Spock on one side and you got Mozart on the other. Would that be considered neurodiversity as well?
Yeah, it's very important, and sort of to repeat the fundamental definition of this. It's neurodiversity is a human fact, just like biodiversity is a fact of the natural world. So there's no one normal brain. Now, what we've done is put labels on people within that broader human spectrum, that if you have a cluster of traits, then you qualify as a diagnosis of this or that. And there's a lot of debate as to what should qualify for a diagnosis, or indeed what's called neurodivergence. So what qualifies as being neurodivergent from a norm? It's complicated because really there isn't a norm. It's also a very muddy picture. There's many people who may be autistic but don't want to tell you about it. There's also a lot of research that says people, particularly women, particularly people from ethnic minorities, haven't had access to a diagnosis, and so may be technically neurodivergent but don't know it. So the way we think about this is to respect the fact that people who are autistic or dyslexic or ADHDers and so on have clearly been misunderstood, stereotyped and marginalized at work because people haven't understood them and haven't appreciated their skills. And so I think there is an urgent inclusion case there. But this is actually something bigger as well. And actually neurodiversity and neuroinclusion at work, because it just refers to how everybody thinks, benefits everybody.
For sure. Because what I'm really trying to get to the bottom of here for the people, for myself, as well as for the people who may be like me and neophytes in this, is now we've had neurodiversity and now we kind of layered in another term, neurodivergence. And so I want the average person listening to go, okay, well, I could be neurodiverse, but am I neurodivergent? Or are they mutually inclusive in that where, okay, society has branded someone neurodivergent if you cross a line of neurodiversity? Does that make sense?
Yes, I think the easy way to think of it is neurodiversity is a fact of humanity.
Yes.
Therefore, humans and teams are neurodiverse. The three of us in the room, we all have a different brain, right? There is a sense of what's called neurodivergence from typicality. That doesn't mean people who are not neurodivergent are all the same, but there is something called neurodivergence as being people who have a particular what's called neuroidentity, which is not broadly neurotypical. And that would be people who are, say, autistic or dyslexic or dyspraxic and so on. And that's all come from the medicalization of those differences, the medicalization that said, right, people, and it's all behavior based. It's not sort of more scientific than that. It's that if you manifest these behaviors, we're going to give you a label. And over time, people have come to reclaim those labels and say, no, that's my identity. But it's an identity within the human spectrum of neurodiversity. So we can draw those lines. We have to remember, look, ultimately this is about people. If this is your team, this is about people. Not everybody's going to have a conscious neuroidentity. Doesn't mean they don't have their own brain, their own preferences, their own ways of doing things as well.
I love that. Now I want to take a step back because this is a very narrow slice and specific slice of training, education, understanding, all of that stuff. How did you get here? Tell us a little bit about your backstory now. So now we got the base of what we're going to talk about, but now let's talk about you for a minute. You and I wanted you to include the traumatic brain injury that you had, and what role, if any, did that play in you getting here?
Yeah, absolutely. So about 10 years ago, I'd never heard of the term either, right? I was working for a tech company in London. And they say these days, HR priorities have become CEO priorities. And I saw that firsthand because I was expecting to do, if you like, commercial work. But actually my boss, the CEO's big priorities were all around people. How do we hire the best talent? Like a lot of tech companies, we had a lot of open roles that weren't getting filled. We had a sense that everybody sort of looked the same and probably thought the same. And was this the way to build a 21st century company? Probably not. So I got involved, rather to my surprise, in very strategic sort of business-led diversity initiatives to actually meet some of those big talent challenges that my CEO was telling me about in the boardroom. And particularly, we got involved in apprenticeships and giving young people from disadvantaged backgrounds in London a chance to get started in the tech sector. And it was interesting because it's easy to focus on the individual stories with work like that. And I remember one of my colleagues was crying because we had a teenage guy who'd been a refugee from Afghanistan, and we were going to give him a chance on this program, and he's gone on to do these great things because of it. And you knew this was just a pivotal moment in his life. But I was very interested as well in the impact on the organization of this stuff, and actually the way that this diverse hiring really energized people, giving them a sense of, belief and attachment to the organization's ethos and ideals, and also the different thinking that some of these young people brought into the organization. So I was really passionate about finding other ways to do that. And it was because I'd had a traumatic brain injury, because I had neurodivergent relatives. Talking about this made me interested in what, at this point, and we're talking 2015, 2016, was the incredibly nascent world of what's now called neurodiversity at work. Essentially, a handful of nonprofits 2 or 3 companies thinking, what about neurodiversity? 20% of people think differently. We've never talked about this at work, and actually we all think differently. So I got interested in helping to be part of that. And I think what I realized was functional understanding of this topic is just so low. Right? Nobody's been taught about it. Nobody's been taught about human neurodiversity. Nobody's been taught about the reality of what it's like to be autistic, dyslexic, and so on. Everybody's just heard the terms. Think they know, but they don't. So somebody would have to play the role of educating employers about this. I saw lots of non-profits helping neurodivergent people into work, and I thought that's great. But that's going to be an uphill struggle if organizations just don't get why this is important to them. And I believed it was, and that was the genesis of Uptimize.
What a great story. And so now let's talk about what's the need and the, what would you say, in the statistics. So looking through your website and talking with you a little bit, I understand that there may be a lot more, again, if we parse out neurodiversity, neurodivergence, I think up to 20% or something of us fall into one of those or typical category. Is that right? Or are we all, like you say, each brain is different. We're all
again,
neurodiverse.
It's both, isn't it? I mean, it's every team is made up of people who think differently, and then in society it's estimated, based on some of these kind of diagnostic labels and criteria that we've created, that as many as 20% of people might fall under that category. So I think that for me just kind of accentuates the need and the urgency here. And we hear from people who are openly autistic at work and so on that they face discrimination and misunderstanding and so on. So I think that's sort of accentuating the need, but I will always bring it back to the fact that, look, any team, regardless of how people identify, they're not the same. And it's by appreciating that we create cultures and processes and environments where somebody who is openly neurodivergent says, actually, by the way, yeah, look, I'm dyspraxic and I know my neurotype and I have a diagnosis. So that's how we make everybody successful.
I love that. So now let's bring it kind of into organizations to the level that any of us watching or myself being involved in, our law firm here has 130, 140 people over multiple sites in a couple of states. But then there's another business that I'm involved with that has 2 locations and 8 people. And so when you look at the scale, and I'm sure some of the companies you work with are massive companies, is it a thing where people can identify that they are neurodiverse? Do they know, again, neurodivergent, if there's been some sort of label, that's one thing, or that they feel that way. But then I'm wondering, I'm sure I'm neurodiverse compared to maybe you and maybe Gabe, who's in the room with us. Is it okay, let me phrase this 2 different types. Number one, is it okay to ask people to identify themselves in such a way? Or is that something that, there's one of those questions you don't ask? And if it's okay to ask, how do you go about finding out, other than things like how do you like to receive communication? Email, text, meetings, phone calls. Like, how do you go about figuring out who's who in an organization?
I think that's the wrong ambition, because for a couple of reasons. I think partly kind of privacy and respect. I don't think you do ask people, because there are people who know they are, say, autistic and don't want to tell you. Mm-hmm. And actually it should be up to them to tell you and not up to you. But I also think it's the wrong ambition because a lot of people don't know, if you like, don't have a conscious neuroidentity because they haven't thought about this. But they know that actually maybe they're quite different from colleagues in some ways. And maybe it's only when their child gets a diagnosis as ADHD or whatever, they think, oh, maybe that's me too. So it's a very muddy picture. And I don't think the way to address this is to sort of try and get people to put their hands up and then say, right, what do you need? Also for the reason that everybody's different. And we worked with an organization and they got 3 dyslexic employees into a room and said, right, look, we want to support people like you. What do you need? And they got 3 different answers. Right. So the way we think about this is kind of twofold, and our approach in terms of our training at Uptimize kind of falls within this model. So we apply something called universal design, which is a term that originally came from architecture, and the idea was, how do we build spaces that work for everybody? We really think about some of these things in terms of sensory sensitivities and so on. That's a particularly neurodivergent thing. That got applied then to learning. So people said, well, look, we know there's these learning differences. How do we make the provision of learning inclusive for everybody? You know, whether it's fonts or colors, or it's providing material in advance, and it's the space and so on. So this idea of universal design, which I think of as kind of proactive inclusion, it's how do we think about the 100% and not the 80%? You can apply that to anything. And so that's where little things, I mean, it could be just, you know, not baby talking somebody who appears to have a different tone, not judging somebody who speaks in a kind of flat affect that they might not be interested, not punishing, you know, body language and so on. We've given the example of instructions. You know, a manager, before they start working with a team, saying, look, how would you all like to work with me best? That, in a sense, that's universal design in action, because they're proactively saying, I recognize you're all different. You know, same thing with hiring processes. And so can we make our job descriptions incredibly clear so that people don't read them and think, oh, well, I don't have that one thing, so, and I'm a very literal thinker, so I'm not going to apply. Can we make our application forms easy to use and navigable, and take the stress away with that little timer in the corner? You know, we don't need that. Or can we review our psychometric tests to make sure actually everybody can understand these and use it, not just 70% of people? Because if it's just 70%, we're going to filter out the 30%. So there's a lot that anybody can do. You talked about the example of your organization, whether it's in the team of 100 or the team of 8, just having this consciousness, and it doesn't need to be around labels, just having this consciousness that whether it's culture, whether it's process, whether it's technology, you know, these are all places where we want to optimize for every type of thinker. That's really where it starts.
Boy, that's beautiful. How is it when you're going through then, you mentioned hiring, and I think this is a fantastic kind of jumping off point. If you're, and I think I read this somewhere when I was looking through your stuff, that one company was going to exclude someone from their hiring process, and it ended up being the perfect candidate because they had a different mindset of awareness, which I think awareness is probably something we need to dive into a little bit deeper. But when someone gets to the interview process, let's say that the thing is fine, right? Your application is fine. They get into the process. What do managers, leaders, hiring folks need to know when interviewing someone where they might seem like, man, they don't think like me? What's the process of getting them to go, oh, that could be a good thing based on the role that they're going to play, as opposed to, you know, maybe we need someone that thinks like this in accounting, maybe, and in marketing we need someone that thinks a different way. Now we've got someone in IT, you know, or is that even labeling? Like, how can people who are interviewing get through this process?
Well, no, it's a great question. I think it starts right from the beginning. I remember we interviewed some managers in corporate America a couple of years ago, asking them about this topic, right? Now, a lot of them said, never heard of it. But a lot of them said, when we asked them about diversity of thought, you know, the idea that you have people in your team who have different perspectives and that can be pooled to create these innovative outcomes. They said, yes, that's the one thing I really want. Don't know how to get it, but that's the thing I want. So I think interviewing, we've got to rewind a little bit to just hiring in general. What are we trying to do? And I think, you know, what goes wrong with hiring a lot of the time is that people aren't intentional enough about hiring. And this is a big theme in hiring in general today. But just, you know, what are the outcomes you want to achieve? And therefore, what are the specific skills and experience you need to achieve those outcomes? And what that does is it takes the focus away from what's called kind of rapport-based hiring, right, where it's kind of that liking bias kicks in, and you know, you sort of look like Steve, and Steve did a good job, and you sort of sound like Steve, and I could probably play golf with you, and I used to like playing golf with Steve, and you know, come in, you know, you'll probably be fine. That happens a lot. I think if you really focus on what are we trying to achieve and what are the skills, you stop asking for stuff you don't need for a start. So you stop asking for excellent communication skills, which puts a lot of people off who don't feel they have that. Well, if you don't need it, if you do need it, say. But if you don't need it, and if you do need it, say what type, because some people different verbally and so on. But I think that's the first thing. So just getting to an interview with that kind of intentionality and being very clear on outcomes. It sounds like I'm teaching people to suck eggs, but I mean, I think sometimes people need that that reminder. So hopefully that's the setup in interviews. And then I think in interviews themselves, there's some kind of anti-bias stuff that's quite important. We always talk about being conscious of how people present, being simply how they present, being very open to somebody presenting differently from your mental picture of a candidate. You may have a mental picture of a candidate, if you're honest with yourself, who is, female, mid-20s, white, and so on. Why do you have that picture? And just be open to any other kind of presentation. Not punishing things like body language or a lack of eye contact on. A lot of people who are neurodivergent will say that, that they talk in a certain way and this is assumed that they're not really interested. And so, they get filtered out. And they say, well, no, why do you think I'm at your interview? Of course I'm interested. But that's the frustration. And I think there's some other practical things. The interview environment, is it a comfortable environment with bright lights streaming down on people's head? Is it stressful to have 6 interviewers in front of you giving you kind of rapid fire questions? I think a lot of people find that difficult. And I think ultimately the intentionality, what that does is it helps contextualize an interview as a test of social performance to some extent within that goal of hiring somebody who has these skills, a lot of which probably aren't social performance unless we're hiring a presenter, and actually allows us to interview in a slightly more kind of humane fashion, and also opens us up to providing different types of assessment that might appraise those skills more effectively.
Sure. So now let's flip the script. For someone who's watching or listening that think either A, they've been given a neurodivergent diagnosis, for lack of a better term, or label, or who just feels like, I just feel sometimes a little bit different, and they're wanting to apply for a job.
Some of these things don't suit them.
Yeah, or apply for a promotion. What tips or advice would you have for them for basically helping them to navigate those waters, knowing they might be going into a situation where no one's familiar with the things we're talking about? So how should they best go through that process?
I think it's an incredibly difficult question because you've got a myriad of different situations, different brain wirings of all of those individuals, which we know is infinite, and then very different contexts in terms of where they're applying, or if they have a manager, the familiarity of that. That's not something that, we know or sadly at the moment we can guarantee. We don't even give organizations that we work with a badge saying, look, you're neuroinclusive, because I can't control for one manager who didn't show up or didn't take our training and doesn't get it at all. So it's very difficult to generalize. I mean, I think I have friends who will insist, look, I'm going to mask, which is pretending to be so-called neurotypical. So I'm not going to disclose. I'm going to, in a sense, just put on this front. But I'm going to, do that because I don't want to be judged. And I think that's a sad reality, but one to some extent you have to respect if that's what people have decided to do based on their lived experience. I would hope that self-advocating, and doesn't have to be a disclosure with a doctor's note, but just the clarity on, look, if we're going to work together, I want you to know some things about how I like to work, and here's how I like to organize my work, and here's the sort of environment I like to work in, and here's the flexibility I'd need to be successful. I can't help but feel that's positive, but I can't guarantee what the response will be. And it's interesting, in organizations we've worked with, there is a sort of numbers game sometimes, and we'll speak to somebody who is passionate about this, wants to bring it into their company, wants everybody to care because they care, and it would change their whole experience, and they know it would be good for their whole team. But they go to their manager, they go to HR, and one person, whatever, too much effort. But once they start coming together in what's known as an enterprise resource group or something, a network in one of these big companies where suddenly there's 50, or in one case in my book 400 people who are neurodivergent in a group saying, hey, what about us? We're already here. Can we pay some attention to this, please? Because our managers, our colleagues and stuff have no clue. That's when you get this momentum, and it's harder for HR to say, no, we're not going to bother. Particularly when you think, and this is just a little bit extra, but it's fascinating. You look at the goals of organizations today. I mentioned HR priorities have become CEO priorities. What do you see? You read an annual report in corporate America. You look at a website. What do they care about? People. We recognize people are our most expensive and important asset, right? We care about innovation. The lifespan of companies is plummeted. It used to be 50, 60 years. So companies with these big oil tankers cruising along fine, nothing's going to sink them, completely changed in the 21st century. It's down to about 15 years. So if you're not innovating, somebody else is, you're in trouble. So it's like, we know our people are really important. Probably we know our people are going to be the ones innovating. We know innovation is really important. We're throwing money at R&D. So everybody has these aspirations. I think what's interesting and what we try to help organizations do is just join the dots to the way that people think. Because if your people are your most important asset, and they're the ones who are going to be innovating, what's the one tool that they all bring to work every day?
Their brain. So good. What about, is there, you can take these tests, and in different countries, they'll take them and they'll literally, I was talking to one of my friends, and a country that he had visited, they test kids of a certain age, and wherever the kids test out, that's where they go for life as a profession, right? You're going to go into the labor force, you're going to go towards medicine, blah, blah, blah. When we're talking about neurodiversity, I think we probably need to narrow that down more towards neurodivergence, and I'll let you parse that out. But is there a type of work that is more specifically geared towards certain neurodiverse or neurodivergent mindsets or learning styles or communication styles that you could speak to?
It's also a very good question. This movement at work really started with, I mentioned, tech companies like the one I'd worked at, looking for talent and all fighting over the same, if you like, conventional talent pool, and turnovers through the roof and salaries are through the roof. And somebody started putting two and two together that there's this cultural correlation with autistic people and tech, if you like, nerdiness, and couldn't there be a fit here, and started to explore that. So in some cases there can be, but I think it's what's interesting in terms of our journey at Uptimize. The first training we ever did, and this is 2016, we had a module in one of our e-learnings called Suitable Roles. We didn't say, look, everybody's going to suit being a web developer, but we tried to, because we thought our customers would be interested in this, like you are. We started, we looked and we thought, is it graphic design for dyslexic people? Is it web development for autistic people? But as we were doing our focus group interviews with neurodivergent professionals around the world, all ages, ethnicities, and so on, you realize it's nonsense. It's like saying, what's a suitable role for a British person, because it's just such a variety.
Yeah.
And, far more people buck the stereotypes than conform to them. And a lot of the people we spoke to said, look, I'm autistic, I'm female. Nobody believes that I could be autistic and female. I'm not a web developer. We had somebody work for us who was interested in working on an autism hiring program in the early days and applied. And they said, you've got to go and do a 6-week social skills boot camp. Assuming that, she was really good at tech, but had no social skills. She said, well, I don't need that. I've got pretty good social skills. So in a sense, and I know people get frustrated sometimes by these answers, but really the answer is no. I think it's about being open to the skills and strengths that anybody can bring and finding ways to reward and develop those. And if we think about things like reward paths, on the one hand, I think there's a negative stereotype towards neurodivergent people sometimes, that they couldn't be leaders, they couldn't be managers. Would they have trouble with the paperwork or not have the social skills? Complete nonsense. And there are many, many neurodivergent people who make fine managers in many ways, often because of having this basic empathy for other people's thinking styles, which is really the essence of everything we're trying to teach all managers. They have it because they see it every day. But not everybody wants to develop in that way. And so, can we provide rewards around tenure, or rewards around responsibility, or, different paths through the organization, different opportunities as well? I think that's important, but very critical ultimately not to draw lines and say, that sort of person could never work here, or that sort of person could never be good at this. That's some of the biggest misconceptions we hear around this topic. We don't have anybody like that, or they'd never suit our team. Do you really know the neuro makeup of your team? Probably not.
Right. So when you come into an organization, what do you guys do to evaluate or ascertain the neuro makeup? And we talked about it a little bit earlier, so I'm just kind of circle back around on it, because that's such a great question. And I'm sure people want to know, I wonder what my team is made up of, whether that's in the company they work for, the company they own, their church group that they're part of, their team, right? What do you do?
Well, I think we accept that we don't know. I think that's okay. But I think we accept that we don't know, but we also recognize the variety. We don't need to know exactly who's who, because again, not everybody knows, not everybody wants to tell us. Maybe as we start taking this topic seriously and we start all educating all of us in some of the basics we've gone over, you and I, today, more people feel comfortable saying, actually, by the way, that's me, or that's my son, and let me tell you about my specific profile. That's great. But I think to start with, it's okay just to recognize that difference, just to recognize the neurodiversity of a team being a fact. And then we can either ignore that. If we ignore that, we know that there are all these kind of hidden issues of that. And what's difficult for organizations is a lot of the time these are not things that surface. They're things that, somebody is not hired when they should be. Nobody ever knows that. Somebody leaves and it's because their manager doesn't get them. Nobody ever really quite knows that. And occasionally it surfaces and there's this kind of, conflict with a manager or HR and so on. But a lot of it is kind of under the carpet. So I think for us, it would just be, let's recognize, all of us, that our team, all of our stakeholders are neurodiverse. We're not. People don't walk around with labels on their heads. Doesn't matter. What can we do to create better collaboration, better sales, better customer success? And
you know what I think we could do? And I mean, you might blow me out of the water with this answer and say, nope, you're wrong. I think what we can all do is be the best version of ourselves as a human being that we can, and introduce as much understanding, tolerance, wisdom, compassion. Because if we come at this, at each person from those set of values, or at least operating principles, then I think that we may know that someone learns, acts, behaves, speaks differently, right? Put whatever kind of label on it, call it different. Just like people will be around me and they're like, you're a little bit different. And I'm like, yeah, I kind of am from this.
Right. You don't have you're a great example, because you sort of have that sense, and you have that sense of how people interact with you, but you don't have that kind of conscious neuro identity. Lots of people don't. Yeah. But you know that you're not necessarily the same as everybody else.
Mm-hmm. So us learning to be that best version of ourselves is probably the start, or at least a fundamental piece of allowing people then and seeing them for who they are, instead of going, I mean, I can think of someone in one of our businesses that if you were to just look at him at the surface and go, wow, this person has this set of traits. I wonder how he operates through life with this and that and that. But when you look at what this person does within the system, perfect fit. And so having that understanding and making sure, I think, as Jim Collins would say, put the right person in the right seat on the bus becomes really important. That's the EQ of leadership and management, right? Is that something that you guys delve into?
Yeah, I think of what we're doing as, yes, hopefully changing the experiences of a neurodivergent person in a team who maybe feels marginalized and feels they can't share their true self. So, I hope we're changing their experience, but I really think about this as upgrading a workforce and unlocking and unleashing a lot of that empathy and compassion and humility and openness that we all have. I think people already have this. I think this lens of neurodiversity, if you like, is just opening that door.
And it's just another part of inclusion, right? Like, I know that the bigger mission and vision for you guys as your team is to promote diversity and inclusion at every level. And this is just one that the light of understanding is just starting to be shown on, but it still traverses every other, boundary of inclusion that, we deal with and we've been dealing with for hundreds or thousands of years.
Yeah, it does. And then, so there's various things we can say about that. I mean, I think a lot of organizations, particularly in the US, the last few years, the George Floyd incident, the renewed focus on ethnic minority inclusion, can we really do that while not acknowledging that everybody thinks differently and many people of ethnic minorities are also neurodivergent, maybe struggling, in multiple senses with those minority identities and how those are treated in society and at work. Same thing with women and so on. We know a lot of women who are neurodivergent find themselves, judged and so on because they don't present like people would expect with the stereotypes and so on. So I think those are all things we're already committed to. We can't do that properly if we don't think about this second lens. LGBTQ plus is the same thing. I've heard of people who've, or even physical disability. I've heard of people who've disclosed as deaf and gay, and then it's like, can I disclose as neurodivergent as well? I mean, how much can my team take? But if you don't, then you're not being yourself. And I think it's really important for people who've never had to disclose something at work. What a stress that is, what a difficulty that is, and even for people who are straight, how easy it is just to drop, me and my wife the other day for me, and nobody judges me for that. I haven't have to disclose it. I mean, I kind of disclosing it by saying that, but it's easy. So I think that's really important. What I like about this topic as well is it's very inclusive in the sense that, again, yes, it's about, if you like, in the short term, supporting people who may have been particularly marginalized by the fact that nobody's talked about this. But it does include everybody, and everybody's going to see benefits. What we found with our research is that neurodivergent people often find neuroinclusion mission critical. My manager doesn't let me organize my work the way I want. I'm stuck. But everybody benefits as well. Who doesn't want to be asked, how do you like to organize your work, and when do you like to work, and when's your best time for a meeting, and all of this sensitivity, and how do you like to run meetings? We all like to do that because we all have different needs.
Autonomy.
Yeah.
Right? Like having, that's one thing. Flexibility and autonomy. That's one thing that I've always stressed with the folks that I've worked for, helped lead, whatever it would be, that within each person's role, there is room for a certain amount of autonomy. Now that might be, if you're on an assembly line and, you're chopping meat or assembling shoes, maybe it has to be that way to get the shoes. But thankfully for most of us, if you have 10 things to do a day, you kind of have some autonomy in how you go about that. And I think as leadership managers, astute colleagues, friends, we should be looking out for the chance to allow people to grow and express their best selves through autonomy under the system of whatever the directive is, if that makes sense. Is that kind of what you guys teach in your program?
I think so. I think it's actually a really interesting dynamic. And I think this is something that, I could write a book about as well.
Maybe you should.
Given what I said earlier about the plummeting lifespan of companies, you think about a company's journey, whatever company it is, whatever organization it is, there's a founding period, which is very kind of idea heavy, if you like. What are we going to be? How creative can we be? What's our vision? And so on. And then every organization as it grows has to become this kind of predictable process engine, right? You look at the growth of tech companies as an example, but it's the same for everybody. We've got to all know what we're doing, and if something worked, let's do it again and let's standardize it. And there's a reason for that. But there's going to be a point where, particularly with the pace of change, the pace of innovation, where we're going to need some of that creative thinking again. And just banging out the same process, the same thing for 20 years, someone's going to overtake us. And I think some of our customers have been very open about that challenge as leaders, and thinking, on the one hand, we know how we do it, and we know we're successful because we have these tight processes, and we sort of hire certain types to be able to deliver that. But we also recognize this power of diversity of thought. And if we ignore that, we're going to miss out. And what's the value of that competitor's team where maybe they slow down, and maybe they do allow some of these different types of thinkers into their teams, and some of those folks can say, hey, why don't we do this a little bit differently? And innovation can be process-based as well. And I think organizations should be very open to process innovation. So those little suggestions of how we do things differently, a lot of the time those things are shut down. No, this is the process, and so on. But there's a chance, I think, with more neurodiverse teams to be more creative, whether it's in terms of tweaking or it's in terms of bigger step changes. And I do think that's a challenge. I don't say I have the perfect answer to it. All I'm doing is encouraging organizations to think in terms of balancing those two things, and not just process until we realize actually that's fine, but we've been super efficient going off in direction A, and our competitors have gone off in direction B, and actually that's probably where we should be.
So good. Kind of winding this up, we didn't talk a lot about this necessarily outside of the business world, but these same things are going to be found in any team, right? I mean, it doesn't matter. Any group of people of any size, if we go by just the statistics that you were mentioning earlier, up to 20% of people could be considered up to neurodivergent. So we need to be thinking about these kind of things. And it all goes back to being the good human principle that we talked about, 5-10 minutes ago. What parting words would you have for maybe folks outside of the business world when they're looking at their groups, organizations, teams that maybe they should be looking at, other than what we may have already said?
Well, I think we have covered a lot of it. I wouldn't try to be an amateur diagnostician, if that's the right word. I think that's a difficult and probably fruitless pursuit. But I think it's about having that sensitivity that every interaction you have, whether it's with colleagues, whether it's with your church group, whoever it is, takes place between people with different brains. And we're never taught this, but that's the reality. You're bringing your own preferences, your own brain wiring, your own tolerance for different sensory sensitivities and stuff. You're bringing all of that to these contexts, and so's everybody else. And just to have that basic appreciation of that fact, because I think that then opens the door for some of this sensitivity and sweeps away the assumption that what works for me works for everybody. And it's fascinating here. I think one of the key principles, I have a 1-year-old, right? So I haven't quite got to this stage yet, but one of the key principles we're all taught is treat others like you'd wish to be treated. And I think when it comes to neurodiversity, I think that breaks down, because it's a basic assumption that people are all like us. And I don't think they are. And I think we need to be taught in schools and so on about some of these subtle and in some cases profound differences of how we all experience the world. If we just have that basic appreciation, what we try and do with organizations, you asked what we try and do as a first step, we just try to give them that, because I think that just opens a door. And you think, well, actually, let's think about how we're onboarding over here in this team, or let's think about how we're hiring. Because if you have that perspective, let's think about how I'm selling. Let's think about how I'm engaging with my prospects. If you have that perspective, everything changes a little bit.
For sure. And if I were to boil everything you just said down into basically 3 words, it would be awareness and self-awareness, right? Awareness of the people around you and how they might be different and in a beautiful way, and self-awareness of how you're perceiving the people around you. So that's so cool. If someone wanted to get a hold of you to learn more about what you do, if they could connect with you about their company, about their group, or wanted to learn more, what's the best way to do that, Ed?
Absolutely, and please do. The book is called A Hidden Force, Unlocking the Potential of Neurodiversity at Work. That's available on Amazon and so on. That's, I think, a good overview of this topic with a lot of examples of what people are doing about it and what you can do, whatever your context. We are at uptimize.com, uptimize.com. Do visit us there. I always welcome people contacting me directly. I would caution that we are a organizational training company. I won't be able to help your son or daughter or yourself get a job. We do have partners who do that, so I might be able to point you in the right direction, but do feel free to get in touch if you want to talk about this from your organization's lens. ed.thompson with a P at uptimize.com.
So last question for you. Has there been one piece of advice, one pillar of information that you've either learned or gotten along the way that you feel is now paramount to who you are, what you're doing, the life that you're living and that you're creating, that you would be willing to share with us?
The one I would say is focus. I think it's been very challenging with this business, particularly because societal awareness is slow to change, and the picture in 2017 when we were building this was very, very different from now. Very, very different. I wasn't doing podcasts every day. It's easy to get pulled in different directions. I think when you start an organization, you want to feel like this big risk, this big commitment of time can go to the moon, and you want to think, oh, everybody could use it, and we universities, and we could do this for these people, and we do this because you want to feel like it's just, and actually I learned, I think quite young, and it was quite a valuable lesson, that having that kind of focus and just really trying to be the best in one thing, and in my company's case it's been organizational readiness solutions around neurodiversity and neuroinclusion, has paid off, I think. And there's been times where customers have said, look, do you do anything else on disability in general? If so, we'll buy it from you. We've had people say, particularly in the early days when people used to think neurodiversity was about hiring people we don't have, because nobody was thinking about the fact that our team is already neurodiverse. They'd say, can you recruit people for us? People would come to us and say, can you build training for autistic job seekers and so on? Now, all of these would have been business opportunities, but we said no to all of them because that wasn't our mission. We believed our mission was big, our mission was important. And we've really kind of stuck to that vision. I think that's ultimately been the right thing, because people know that when they need this thing, that we can provide them, and we passionately believe everybody does, and it's so important, and it just transforms your workforce, that they trust us to do it.
Boy, Ed Thompson, what a great visit, man. This was a wonderful education for me, just a bathing in information to make me think, and how to take that and spread it across our businesses and our teams. And man, I just can't thank you for the time. I know how busy you are, and I wish you nothing but success, and understand that you always have a friend here at Ramos Law.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So for those of you that watch this and listen to it, this may be one that you need to wrap your head around a couple of times, because if it's new to you like it was to me, again, you may just have to get a little rep on this. But please do me a favor, and if this was meaningful to you, share it with someone. Send it to someone who works in a company culture, or even has some sort of need to understand why are they treated different, or why do they seem different. But this is a really important message. So if you would do that, I would appreciate it. Until next time, get out there and make a difference.